Imagine you are a Roman general standing on the edge of the Syrian desert in the year 634 AD. Behind you is the full weight of the greatest empire the Western world has ever known. Centuries of unbroken military tradition, armies that have marched from Britain to Persia, soldiers who have bled for emperors and gods and glory. You have fortified walls, cavalry, supply lines, professional soldiers trained since childhood. You have everything. And then you hear a report that sends a chill through your spine. A force of Arab riders is moving through the desert toward your frontier. You're told they are not raiders. You're told they are not bandits looking for a quick score and a retreat back into the sand. They have a mission. They have a faith. They have a commander named Amr ibn al-As, who fights like a man who has already made peace with dying. And before you can fully comprehend what's coming, before your messengers even reach Constantinople, these men are already at your gates. This is not a story most people know. This is not the Crusades. It's not the fall of Rome to the Germanic tribes. It's not a story Hollywood has put on a big screen. But I want to make the argument today that the Battle of Wadi Al-Arabah and the Battle of Dathin, these two clashes that happened on the southern edge of Byzantine Palestine in the year 634, these battles changed the world more profoundly than almost any military engagement you've learnt about in school. Because what happened in those dusty stretches of land between the desert and the sea was not just a military upset, it was the opening punch of a conquest that would reshape civilization itself. And the shocking truth is that it was done by a force that should not have won, not on paper, not by any conventional military logic, not by the calculations that any Roman general or any modern military historian would have made looking at the numbers and the terrain and the resources on each side. So stay with me, because I'm going to walk you through every piece of this story. I'm going to show you the world as it was just before that first clash of swords. I'm going to walk you through the battles themselves, almost blow by blow. And then I'm going to show you why these two battles that lasted only hours changed the next 14 centuries of human history. Let's go. To understand how this happened, you have to understand the world of 634 AD. And when I say the world, I mean you have to feel it, not just memorize dates. Because this is a world that has been at war for so long that the people living in it have almost forgotten what peace looks like. The Byzantine Empire, which is what historians call the Eastern Roman Empire, had just finished one of the most catastrophic wars in its entire history. Emperor Heraclius, one of the most capable rulers Byzantium ever produced, had spent decades locked in a death struggle with the Sassanid Persian Empire. This was not a border skirmish. This was a total war that consumed both empires entirely. At one point, the Persians had captured Jerusalem. They had taken the true cross, the most sacred relic in all of Christianity. They had pushed all the way to the Bosphorus, the strait that separates Europe from Asia, and they were standing on the shore looking at Constantinople itself. The Byzantine Empire was, at that moment, on the edge of total collapse. Heraclius pulled off a miracle. He reorganized. He borrowed money from the church. He launched a counterattack so audacious it stunned even his own generals. He marched deep into Persian territory, fought a series of brilliant campaigns, shattered the Persian military, and forced a peace that restored everything including the true cross. He came back to Constantinople a hero. He was called the New David, the New Alexander. The crowds in the streets wept with joy. But here is the cruel truth of that victory. It was hollow. Both empires had bled each other nearly to death. The Byzantine military treasury was essentially empty. The armies were exhausted and reduced. The provinces that had been fought over, the lands of Syria and Palestine and Egypt, were economically shattered. The people in those provinces, many of whom were Monophysite Christians who had theological disputes with the official Byzantine Church, felt little loyalty to Constantinople. They had been taxed mercilessly to fund the war. They had watched Byzantine soldiers and Persian soldiers march back and forth across their farms for decades. They were done, they were tired, they had no fight left for anyone. Meanwhile, something was happening in Arabia that almost nobody in Byzantium or Persia had bothered to pay close attention to. A man named Muhammad had been preaching a new faith in the cities of Mecca and Medina. He had died in 632 AD, just 2 years before the battles we're talking about. But the faith he had built and the community he had forged did not die with him. If anything, it intensified. His closest companion and father-in-law, Abu Bakr, became the first caliph, the first successor to lead the Muslim community, and Abu Bakr faced an immediate crisis because a significant portion of the Arabian tribes, now that the Prophet was gone, decided they no longer owed allegiance to Medina. Some of them stopped paying the zakat, the religious tax. Some of them outright apostatized. Some of them rallied around new prophets of their own. Abu Bakr's response to this was swift and absolute. He launched what historians call the Ridda Wars, the Wars of Apostasy. Within roughly a year, his generals, men like Khalid ibn al-Walid, had crushed every rebellion and reunified the Arabian Peninsula under the banner of Islam. And here is the critical thing. By the time those wars were over, the Muslim armies were not a tired force limping back to Medina to rest. They were a battle-hardened, ideologically unified, supremely motivated military force that had just finished fighting a fast-paced, highly mobile war across hundreds of miles of desert. They were lean, they were sharp, and they had nowhere left to conquer on the peninsula itself. Abu Bakr had a decision to make, and the decision he made would echo down through time. He decided to send his armies north, into the territories of Byzantium and Persia. Now I want you to think about how insane this looks on paper. The Byzantine Empire at its weakest was still one of the largest and most powerful political entities on earth. Its army, even depleted, was vastly larger than anything the Muslim forces could field. Its soldiers wore heavy armor. They had disciplined formations. They had cavalry trained specifically to counter infantry. They had access to fortified cities with walls and towers and siege equipment. They had a professional officer corps
but at what cost?
that had been studying military
This victory
science for
feels so
centuries.
hollow.
They had supply lines. They had everything. The Muslim forces heading into Palestine were at their core a relatively small and mobile raiding army. The initial force that Abu Bakr sent into the region under the command of Amr ibn al-As numbered somewhere between 3,000 and 7,000 men, depending on which source you trust, and scholars debate this constantly. Even at the higher estimate, this was not a world-conquering army. These were men on camels and horses, lightly armed compared to Byzantine heavy infantry, dependent on captured supplies and the hospitality of local populations, fighting far from home. And yet, there is something about the moment, just before the blow lands, that conventional military analysis always fails to capture. Numbers and armor and supply lines tell you who should win on paper. They do not tell you about morale. They do not tell you about the difference between an army fighting because it has been conscripted and an army fighting because it believes with total conviction that God is on its side. They do not tell you about leadership, and they do not tell you about desperation. Because when you are a soldier who has marched thousands of miles from home, who cannot retreat into a comfortable supply depot, who has nothing behind him but desert, you fight differently than a soldier who knows there's a warm camp waiting 2 miles back. Amr ibn al-As understood this. He was one of the most brilliant, tactical minds of the early Islamic period. He was not a simple man of faith charging blindly. He was a strategist. He had been a merchant before Islam, which meant he understood people. He understood how economies worked. He understood how to read terrain and read opponents. He had converted to Islam relatively late, after spending years as a skeptic and even an opponent. But when he came to the faith, he came with his full intelligence intact, and that intelligence was considerable. The initial forays into Byzantine Palestine in late 633 and early 634 were probing actions. Amr moved his forces through the Negev desert, the harsh southern wilderness that the Byzantines had always assumed was a natural barrier. Nobody crosses the Negev in force, except Amr did. He knew that if he could come up through the south, he could threaten the rear of Byzantine positions, while other Muslim forces pushed in from the east through Jordan. The Byzantine commanders in Palestine were caught watching the wrong door. Now let me tell you about the man the Byzantines sent to deal with this problem. His name was Sergius, and he was the governor of Caesarea Maritima, the administrative capital of Byzantine Palestine. He was also the brother-in-law of Emperor Heraclius himself. Which tells you something important. The Byzantines did not initially treat this Arab incursion as an existential threat. They treated it as a serious border security problem, the kind of thing a capable governor with a good military force should be able to handle. Sergius was dispatched to push these Arabs back into the desert where they came from, restore order, and send a message that Byzantine Palestine was not to be trifled with. Sergius gathered his forces and moved south to intercept Amma. And this is where the geography becomes critical, because to understand the battle, you have to understand the land. The area around Wadi Al-Arabah, the great rift valley that runs south of the Dead Sea into the Gulf of Aqaba, is extraordinary terrain. It is a world of contrast. You have rocky highlands on both sides, with the valley floor below stretching out flat and exposed. To the west is what is today the Negev region of southern Israel. To the east is the desert of Jordan. In between is a landscape that rewards mobility and punishes heavy formations. A large, heavily armored force trying to maneuver in this kind of terrain loses its most important advantage, which is organized mass. The Romans had conquered the world by marching their legions in tight, disciplined formations that could hold ground and push forward like a machine. In open, broken desert terrain, that machine becomes awkward. It moves slowly. It drinks enormous amounts of water. It cannot respond quickly to fast-moving cavalry harassment. Amma knew this. He did not seek to meet the Byzantines in a set-piece battle on ground of their choosing. He used the terrain. He used his mobility. His forces were accustomed to the desert in a way that even experienced Byzantine desert garrison troops were not. The Muslim soldiers could survive on less water, could navigate by stars and sand, could cover ground at speeds that Byzantine commanders found baffling. The engagement at Wadi Al-Arabah was not a single moment where two lines clashed and someone won. It was a series of encounters across a stretch of terrain where Amma repeatedly denied Sergius the decisive engagement that Byzantine military doctrine required. Every time the Byzantine force tried to concentrate and deliver the kind of overwhelming blow that Roman tactics depended on, the Muslim cavalry was somewhere else, raiding the flanks, cutting supply lines, appearing where they were least expected, and then vanishing back into the desert. Sergius found himself chasing shadows in terrain that exhausted his men and horses with every mile. There is a psychological element here that I want to emphasize because it gets lost in the tactical details. The Byzantine soldiers in Palestine had not fought a serious war in years. The big war against Persia had been fought primarily in Anatolia and the Caucasus and Mesopotamia. The garrison troops in Palestine were not the cream of the Byzantine military. They were border units, accustomed to policing raids and managing local populations, not to fighting highly mobile forces of true believers with nothing to lose. When those Byzantine soldiers started seeing their colleagues fall to arrow fire from riders that appeared from nowhere and disappeared before they could be caught, when supply wagons started being hit, when the nights in camp started bringing the distant sounds of movement and challenge, morale began to crack. Not dramatically, not all at once, just a slow, quiet cracking, the kind you can't see until it's too late. The culminating blow came at Dathin. And Dathin is where I want you to really pay attention, because this is the moment the whole story has been building toward. Dathin was a settlement near the town of Gaza, on the southwestern edge of Palestine, close to the Mediterranean coast. Gaza itself was one of the most important cities in the region, a major commercial and military hub that the Byzantines could not afford to lose. When Amma's forces appeared to be threatening the approaches to Gaza, Sergius had no choice but to commit to a decisive battle. He couldn't keep being outmaneuvered. He couldn't keep losing ground and supplies and men to an enemy that refused to stand still. He had to stop these Arabs here, in the fields near Dathin, and he had to do it decisively enough to discourage any further encroachment. The Battle of Dathin was fought in February of 634 AD. The exact date scholars most commonly cite is February 4th, though there is some variation in the sources. What we know from the Arabic Sea, chronicles, from Byzantine sources that mention the aftermath, and from later geographers who describe the site, is that Sergius brought a considerable force to the field. Some sources suggest the Byzantine force numbered somewhere around 3,000 to 5,000, though again the numbers in ancient and medieval sources are always somewhat unreliable. What is clear is that Sergius was confident enough in his position to commit to a direct engagement. Amr arranged his forces with characteristic intelligence. He understood that the Byzantine advantage was in close order heavy infantry and coordinated cavalry charges. Both of those advantages depended on the Byzantine force being able to maintain its formation and execute its tactical doctrine in a controlled way. Amr's goal was to make that impossible. He used his cavalry wings aggressively, not to deliver a decisive blow immediately, but to probe, to test, to identify weaknesses, and create uncertainty in the Byzantine command about where the main threat was coming from. The Muslim warriors fought with what the sources consistently describe as extraordinary ferocity and complete fearlessness. And I want to be careful here, because I do not want to reduce the military reality to simple mythology. The fearlessness was real, but it was not irrational. It was rooted in a specific theological conviction, shared deeply across the Muslim force, that death in this kind of battle was not a defeat, but a passage directly to paradise. This conviction, which was absolutely sincere and not performative, created a psychological dynamic on the battlefield that Byzantine officers had simply never encountered before. Roman soldiers were brave, Byzantine soldiers were brave, but they were brave in the calculated way of men who want to survive and return home. When you are fighting an enemy who genuinely theologically does not fear death, why, OC eyes light up rather than darken at the prospect of the final blow. You are fighting something outside your training. You are fighting something that breaks the psychological script that all military training relies on. Sergius's lines began to buckle under the pressure. The Muslim cavalry found the flanks, the infantry in the center, already shaken by the relentless pressure and the psychological weight of fighting an enemy unlike any they had faced, began to give ground. What started as tactical withdrawal turned into retreat. What turned into retreat turned into rout. And in the ancient and medieval world, a rout was almost always more deadly than the battle itself. Once a formation breaks and men start running, cavalry cuts them down almost at will. There is no defense when you are running with your back to the enemy. Sergius himself died in the battle. The exact circumstances of his death vary across the sources. Some say he was caught in the rout, some say he fell in the final moments of the fighting. What is consistent across all the accounts is that he died at Dathin, that his army was destroyed, and that the Byzantine military presence in southern Palestine effectively collapsed in a single afternoon. The news that reached Constantinople was stunning. A senior official, the brother-in-law of the emperor himself, had been killed. A professional Byzantine army had been annihilated by Arab raiders in the desert south of Palestine. Emperor Heraclius, by now an old man worn down by decades of war, understood immediately that this was not a border security problem anymore. This was something else. He reportedly said, when the news reached him, words that have been quoted and debated ever since. The exact phrasing varies depending on which translation you use, but the essence was a lament. He was bidding farewell to Syria. He could see what was coming. NDD, he could see that he did not have the resources to stop it. That is an extraordinary moment of clarity from a man who had spent his entire life fighting and winning impossible wars. Heraclius had defeated the Persians when everyone said it couldn't be done. But he looked at what happened at Dathin, and he understood that the dynamic had changed in a way that military force alone could not reverse. And why? Why did he see it so clearly when his generals were still arguing about sending reinforcements and regrouping? Because Heraclius was a political genius as well as a military one, and he understood what the Arab victory at Dathin represented at the political and social level. The populations of Syria and Palestine, those Monophysite Christians who resented Byzantine theological domination, those local Arab tribes who had been Byzantine allies, but who now felt the wind changing. Those merchants and farmers who had been taxed to exhaustion to fund a war that had left their towns and farms in ruins, they were not going to fight for Constantinople. They were going to wait and see. And in that waiting, that quiet neutrality, the Byzantine Empire had already lost half the battle. I want to pause here and zoom out, because sometimes when you are deep in the details of a specific battle, it's easy to lose track of the scale of what happened next. The Battle of Dathin in February 1634 was followed by a cascade of events that unfolded with breathtaking speed. The Muslim forces, emboldened by their victories, and now joined by additional armies under the command of other companions of the Prophet, pressed north and east into Palestine and Syria. Khalid ibn al-Walid, the most feared Muslim general of the era, was dispatched from the Persian front to take command of operations in Syria. He made one of the most audacious marches in military history, crossing the Syrian in a matter of days, in a maneuver that Byzantine intelligence considered completely impossible. The Battle of Ajnadayn in July 1634 further shattered Byzantine military power in Palestine. Abu Bakr, who had authorized all of this, died that same summer. He was succeeded by Umar ibn al-Khattab, who proved to be an administrator of extraordinary talent, coordinating the dual campaigns against Persia and Byzantium simultaneously across thousands of miles with almost no modern communication technology. By 636, at the Battle of the Yarmouk, in what is today the border between modern Jordan and Syria, the main Byzantine army under the direct command of the emperor's brother Theodore was obliterated in one of the most decisive battles in all of human history. Khalid's tactics, the same fundamental approach that Amr had demonstrated at Wadi Al-Arabah and Dathin, defeating a superior force through mobility, terrain advantage, and overwhelming psychological pressure, worked again at a scale of tens of thousands of men. By 637, Arab forces had captured Jerusalem. By 638, Syria was gone. By 641, Egypt was falling. The whole eastern Mediterranean, the heartland of the ancient world, the land of Alexander and Caesar and Moses and Jesus, was passing under Muslim control within a single decade of Dathin. When historians try to explain this, and they have been trying for 14 centuries, they invariably come back to those early battles, to Wadi Al-Arabah, to Dathin, to the fundamental mismatch not just of armies but of motivation, of social cohesion, of spiritual energy, of leadership quality, and of the particular moment in history when the Arab forces arrived. I want to talk about something that I think gets underemphasized in most histories of this period, which is the role of the common soldier on both sides. We talk about Amr ibn al-As's genius and Heraclius's strategic miscalculations and the theological convictions of the Muslim fighters. But I want you to think about the individual human beings standing in that field, near Dathin on a February morning in 634. On the Byzantine side, picture a soldier from perhaps Thrace or Anatolia or even Egypt, a man who has been posted to this dusty border garrison for months or years. He has heard that his emperor defeated the Persians. He has probably never seen a major battle himself. He is paid, not particularly well, and he receives irregular supplies. He has heard rumors about these Arabs from the south, and the rumors are strange and alarming in a way that doesn't quite match anything in his experience. They don't fight like Persians. They don't fight like the nomadic raiders he has dealt with before, who take what they can and run. These men are singing. Some of them are reciting what sounds like prayer while they advance into arrow fire. They do not stop when they should stop. They do not break when they should break. On the Muslim side, picture a young man from the Hejaz, from perhaps a tribe that had been raiding and trading across the Arabian Peninsula for generations. He is not naive about death. He has seen it. He has dealt it. But he carries something in his chest that is genuinely new, something that had not existed in Arabia or in the world in quite this form before. He believes, not in the way most people believe in things they've been told since childhood, with a kind of passive background faith. He believes with the kind of active, living, immediate certainty that makes him feel that the moment he is in right now, this march north into the land of the Romans, is the most important thing that has ever happened in human history. He is not wrong. He just doesn't know yet how right he is. That difference between the motivated volunteer and the tired professional is the secret engine behind what happened at Dathin. Military historians will give you the tactics and the geography and the logistics, and they will all be true and important. But at the end of the day, battles are decided by men, and men are decided by what they believe. Let me also address something that I think needs to be said, which is the question of how the local populations of Palestine and Syria responded to all of this. Because the simplistic narrative, the one that gets told in both Arab nationalist history and in Western polemical history, is either that the populations joyfully welcomed their liberators or that they were brutally conquered and had no voice in the matter. The real history, as always, is more complicated and more interesting. The Arab conquerors under Abu Bakr and Umar operated under specific rules regarding the treatment of conquered populations that were, by the standards of the 7th century, genuinely remarkable. Non-Muslims, specifically Jews and Christians, were classified as dhimmis, protected peoples. They were not forced to convert. They were allowed to practice their faith, maintain their churches and synagogues, govern their own communal affairs. They paid a special tax called the jizya in exchange for this protection, and they were excluded from military service and from certain political roles. By modern standards, this system is discriminatory and we should call it that. But by the standards of 634 AD, in a world where conquest routinely meant massacre, enslavement, or forced conversion, this was a form of governance that many populations genuinely preferred to what they had. The Monophysite Christians of Syria, who had been persecuted by the Byzantine Orthodox establishment for centuries over doctrinal disputes about the nature of Christ that would take me an hour to explain, found that the Arab rulers were considerably less interested in their theology than the Byzantine emperors had been. They could worship as they wished. The Jewish communities of Palestine, who had experienced significant persecution under Byzantine rule, including restrictions on living in Jerusalem itself, found that the new Arab rulers were more tolerant of their presence in the holy city. This did not mean life was easy, or equal, or free of injustice. It means that the social reality of the conquest was more nuanced than either romantic glorification or simple horror. Some Byzantine garrison commanders surrendered without significant resistance once it became clear that the terms being offered were reasonable. Some cities negotiated rather than fighting to the last man. The conquest moved as quickly as it did not just because of military superiority, but because significant portions of the local population concluded that fighting to preserve Byzantine rule was not worth the cost. Now I want to come back to the long view, to the question of why these battles matter to us today, and not in the vague high school textbook sense of everything being connected to everything else. I mean concretely, specifically, what threads run from the field at Dathin on that February morning to the world you are living in right now. The most obvious thread is religious geography. The Muslim conquest of the Middle East, North Africa, Persia, and eventually Spain and Central Asia established the demographic and cultural patterns that still define those regions today. Islam is the dominant religion in the Arab world, not because it was always the native faith of those populations, but because of what began in the deserts of Palestine. In 634, every mosque from Morocco to Indonesia, every call to prayer from Dhaka to Jakarta, every Islamic university, every piece of Islamic art and architecture and philosophy and science traces its prayer essence in the world back to that cascade of conquests that began with Dathin. But the consequences are equally profound for the lands that were not conquered. Byzantium's loss of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt stripped the empire of its wealthiest and most populous provinces. The empire that remained, reduced to Anatolia, Greece, and parts of the Balkans, was a diminished thing. It survived for another 8 centuries, until 1453, but it was never again the power it had been. And, because Byzantium spent those centuries in defensive struggle against first the Arab caliphates and then the Seljuk and Ottoman Turks, it was never able to serve as the bridge between classical antiquity and medieval Europe that it might otherwise have been. The Western European world cut off from direct land contact with the East by the new Muslim powers, was forced to develop in more isolation. The medieval period in Europe, with all its particular character, its feudalism, its isolation, its eventual hunger for classical learning that produced the Renaissance, is shaped in part by the political geography that Dathin helped create. The Crusades, those extraordinary and terrible medieval wars between Christian Europe and the Muslim world over the holy places of Palestine, would never have happened if Dathin had gone differently. If Sergius had beaten Amr ibn al-As on that February morning, if the Byzantine line had held and the Arab forces had been driven back into the desert, then Palestine and Jerusalem might have remained Christian territories. The impulse to recapture the Holy Land would have had nothing to recapture. The entire civilizational collision between Latin Christianity and Islam that defined the next several centuries might have been deflected or delayed or taken a completely different form. And if you follow those threads further, the Crusades shaped the relationship between Europe and the Arab world in ways that are still felt today. The mutual suspicion, the competing narratives of victimhood and grievance, the way each civilization has defined itself, partially in opposition to the other. These are products of a history that runs back through Constantinople and through Jerusalem and through Ajnadayn and the Yarmouk and back, ultimately, to Dathin. I also want to say something about what this story tells us about the nature of change itself. Because one of the things I find most striking about the history of this period is how quickly it happened. Human beings have a tendency to assume that the world they are born into is permanent. The Byzantine citizens of the 7th century had every reason to believe that Rome, in its eastern continuation, would last forever. Rome had already lasted for over 1,000 years. Its institutions, its language, its laws, its military traditions, these were woven into the fabric of civilization. They seemed as permanent as the mountains. And then, in roughly a decade, the entire eastern Mediterranean changed hands. This kind of radical, rapid transformation is terrifying from a human perspective. For the people living through it, those Byzantine farmers and merchants and garrison soldiers who woke up one morning as subjects of the Roman emperor and went to sleep that night as subjects of a Muslim caliph, the speed of change must have been almost incomprehensible. It violated every expectation and every prior experience. And yet it happened. It happened because of a confluence of factors: exhaustion, ideology, leadership, timing, geography, social fracture that built to a tipping point. And once you reach the tipping point, the avalanche does not wait for anyone to adjust their expectations. History does this. It moves slowly, and then all at once. And the moments when it moves all at once are Ost, never the moments that people in the center of events recognize as turning points. The Byzantine soldiers who survived Dathin and trudged back toward Gaza probably thought they were reporting a significant defeat, a setback that would require reinforcements and a serious military response. They probably did not think they were reporting the beginning of the end of Roman rule in the Middle East. They could not have known. They were too close to see it. We have the advantage of being 14 centuries away. Before I wrap up, I want to go back one more time to Amr ibn al-As, because I think he deserves more credit than he typically gets in the popular telling of this story. The popular narrative of the early Islamic conquests tends to focus on the extraordinary quality of the movement itself, the faith, the unity, the ideological force of early Islam. And all of that is true and important, but military campaigns do not win themselves just because the army is motivated. Motivation without intelligence is just expensive courage. What Amr brought to the battlefield was the ability to translate that motivation into effective military action. He chose his terrain with care. He refused to fight on ground that favored the enemy. He used intelligence about Byzantine dispositions and movements in ways that suggest he had a sophisticated network of informants among the local Arab tribes who had been Byzantine clients. He understood supply and logistics in a way that allowed him to keep his force operational in hostile terrain far from its home bases. He understood the psychology not just of his own men, but of his opponents, and he shaped the conditions of battle to maximize his side's psychological advantages. while minimizing Byzantine advantages. This is what great generalship looks like, and it is worth naming and honoring, regardless of which side of the historical narrative you approach it from. Amr went on to conquer Egypt a few years after Dathin, another extraordinary campaign against a Byzantine force that should have beaten him on paper and did not. He proved at every stage that his success at Wadi Al-Arabah and Dathin was not luck or divine intervention alone. It was also the product of a mind that was operating at the very highest level of military art. So here is where we land. The year is 634 AD. The place is a stretch of land near Gaza, in what we would today call the Gaza Strip and southern Israel. A force of Arab warriors, perhaps 7,000 strong, perhaps fewer, has just destroyed a professional Byzantine army and killed its commander. Nobody in Constantinople or Rome or Alexandria can quite believe it yet. The reports are confused. Maybe it was an isolated incident. Maybe the garrison simply failed in its duty. Heraclius is already seeing the larger shape of what is coming, but even he cannot fully grasp how much is about to change. In less than a decade from this morning, the Byzantine Empire will have lost Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. The Persian Empire will cease to exist entire. The world will look different than it has looked since Alexander. And the chain of events that leads to all of this starts here, in the sand and the heat, with a general named Amr and a few thousand men who believed they were doing the most important thing in the world. They were. The Battle of Wadi Al-Arabah and the Battle of Dathin are not famous in the way that Thermopylae is famous, or Gettysburg is famous, or Agincourt is famous. They do not have movies made about them. They do not appear in most Western history curricula, but their consequences, the world they helped create, the fault lines they established between civilizations, the faiths they entrenched in their geographies, the empires they ended, and the empires they began, are everywhere around us. Every time you look at a map of the Middle East, every time you read about the conflict between the Western world and the Arab world, every time you see the skyline of any city from Casablanca to Karachi, you are looking at the long shadow of that February morning in 634. And that, I think, is what makes history worth knowing. Not the dates, not the names. The understanding that the world we live in was made by specific choices, by specific battles, by specific generals who decided to cross the desert when everyone said it couldn't be done. The world is not inevitable. It was made. And it was made, in no small part, in the dust and blood of Dathin. That's the story for today. If you made it this far, thank you. Genuinely. This is the kind of history that I think deserves more attention than it gets. And if you learned something today, or if this made you want to go deeper into the early Islamic conquests, or into Byzantine history, or into the world of 7th century Arabia, let me know in the comments. Tell me what you want to explore next. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button, because we have a lot more stories like this one coming. Stories that changed the world and that most people have never heard. I will see you in the next one.